Welcome to the 2024 By Degrees Climate Summit, a collaboration between New Hampshire Public Radio and New Hampshire PBS. NHPR's By Degrees reporting project was created in order to tell stories of local people grappling with the challenges of our changing world and exploring possible solutions. Over the course of the summit, we heard from pioneering journalists, environmental activists, and industry leaders. They shared their insights, strategies, and success stories, demonstrating that through collaboration and know-how, we can make a significant difference for our New England communities. In this hour, we'll hear the second of two panel discussions featuring journalists from around the region. Today's discussion is centered on the question, what role can solutions-based journalism play in affecting community action and accountability? This conversation was recorded before a live audience on May 23, 2024 at the University of New Hampshire, Durham, and is moderated by NHPR's Rick Ganley.
Well, welcome to today's second panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rick Ganley, host of NHPR's Morning Edition. Earlier, we heard from experts who are working to make their communities more resilient to the effects of climate change. And now we're going to be spending some time with the people who cover our communities, our towns, and our cities, working to bring important information about the environment and the changing climate to the broader public. So joining us are four journalists who bring a really broad amount of coverage to solutions-based journalism, climate coverage, to help our communities through this. I'd like to introduce you now to the journalists here with me on stage. We're very happy to have them, and we're very lucky to have them, and thank you all for joining us. Hoplamazian covers climate change, energy, and the environment for NHPR. My colleague in the newsroom sits just 10 feet away from me. A pleasure. Maura also helps lead our By Degrees climate reporting project that tells stories of the people grappling with the challenges of our changing world and exploring possible solutions. Neela Banerjee is the Chief Climate Desk Editor for NPR. The Climate Desk at NPR focuses on making complex science accessible to audiences, spotlighting barriers to addressing climate change, and explaining solutions and revealing how climate change has disproportionately affected marginalized people. And we're really happy to have you here, Neela. Thank you. Paula Mora is an independent audio reporter in New England. She was formerly a reporter on WBOR's Climate and Environment team, where she covered local communities' resilience to climate change. Welcome. And Abagael Giles covers climate and the environment for Vermont Public. She focuses on the energy transition and how the climate crisis is affecting Vermonters and Vermont's landscape in particular. Welcome. So great to have all of you on stage here. I've enjoyed all of your reporting over the years. And I actually want to start with a question that we did get from the audience that came up in our last panel. And I think this is a great kind of a bridge question to this panel. So let's put this to you. Susan from Durham asks, again, have we abandoned discussions of ways to reverse climate change? Can journalism reignite that? Maura, let's start with you.
Yeah. So I think about this a lot. I think in my work as a local reporter, often what I'm covering a lot of the time is climate change impacts. If there's a weather event, if there's a study comes out, and we see sea level rises getting worse, farmers are losing crops in a rainy summer. And so I hear that, like the idea that we're focusing a lot on impact and not so much on solutions. I try really hard to cover solutions. I don't think we're ignoring it in the journalists I know. But I do think the idea of framing is really important. So in all of my stories about climate change impacts, I try to, add the context that humans caused climate change and are causing climate change. The IPCC says every ton of carbon we emit matters, makes the world warmer. This is a choice, we've made and are making, and I think that context is really important from a solutions lens. And then, of course, covering climate solutions, not just covering them, but bringing the journalistic rigor we bring to everything else, to those solution stories. Who's funding these? Who's benefiting from them? Who's losing out? Is there greenwashing happening? So yeah, I guess that's sort of how I think about solutions, but I'm sure these other journalists have.
Well, that speaks to, you don't want tune out. You don't want to turn people off. You want to give them something, some kind of hopeful reporting as well as the facts, and the facts can be very dark. Abagael, from your standpoint in Vermont, I know you're reporting in the last year with incredible flooding that happened over there. Do you see that? Do you feel that journalism can offer climate solutions that people are paying attention to?
Yeah, I think so. And I think on the topic of kind of fatigue and the sort of desire to tune out, something that I find very reassuring is that whenever we do polling of our audience, time and again, we hear that climate and environment are some of the issues that matter most to them, and in particular around solutions and accountability reporting that happens at the very local level. So I think that there's a critical and important role for local reporters to play, in particular in this space. Not every newsroom can staff a full-time climate reporter in the local news world. I'm one of 2 climate reporters in our state. And, I think that there's a real service that we can provide by, like Mara spoke to, doing really diligent reporting, fact-checking, looking for greenwashing, and kind of, I like to think of it as providing the tools for constructive debate so that communities and people in communities have good information about how to engage on this issue, which really does affect all of us and some of us disproportionately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I liked how you said, you pointed out, kind of pointing out greenwashing. We want to be careful of not being PR agents, obviously. Neela, when setting the editorial strategy for NPR's climate desk, how much weight do you give stories that are focused on solutions? I know your team hired a climate solutions reporter.
So NPR is quite new to having a climate desk. Climate change was covered as a science story for a long time. And so when we got the opportunity to create a climate desk, one of our first priorities was to have a position that would look at solutions. And I think the reason is that solutions, a lot of people like to talk about hope, but I also feel like when you talk about hope, others can be dismissive of that notion and say that you're being Pollyanna. And what we like to think about is agency, right? That we have agency over what is happening in the world. And I just want to go back to that question that Susan asked in the previous thing about, like, if you're talking about solutions, if you're talking about adapting, does that mean that you're giving up on reducing the pollution that's driving climate change? When we work on solutions, both at the network and then with our partners at member stations, and we work with all 3 of these reporters, right? We're looking at solutions that reduce the pollution that's making the planet hotter, and also that help us adapt. Because as a lot of you know, if we turned off all greenhouse gas emissions now, that carbon dioxide is still baked into our atmosphere and the planet would continue to heat. So what we're fighting for is for every 10th of a degree not to make it worse. Because if this is what it looks like right now, 1.1, it beggars the imagination what it's going to look like at 1.5 or 2, right? So that is what the battle is about. It's about adapting to what's happening now and preventing it from getting worse. We do that through a solutions reporter who is wonderful. Unfortunately, she's like one person doing the job of like 4 people at the Washington Post, right? And she does everything from looking at, she's done stories that were really popular that really break it down for our audience. Like, what is a climate solution, and how do you as regular people figure out like what's real and what's not. So that was one of our most popular stories last year. But also when reporters are writing about things that aren't firmly in the solution space, right? They don't just write about the problems, but they write about how we can address them. So for example, our Climate and Corporations reporter, Michael Copley, he's been writing a lot about plastics recently because the fossil fuel industry sees petrochemicals as a way to keep producing and keep adding to their bottom line, even as EVs and renewable energy and all of that drive down use of it as fuel. So plastics are everywhere. It's an issue. How do we deal with it? And so one of the things he's looking at is this treaty about this global treaty that's being negotiated to reduce plastics, right? And the discussions around that and who's in the way of that. So we find through our audiences that they really like solution stories, but they also like, a fact check, like a gut check through accountability. And they really like science that pertains to their lives. And all of these things, I think, are woven together. So that's how we do it. It's not just Julia, our solutions reporter, but every reporter, when they're doing stories, they're not just like laying out a problem for you and then you're miserable. They're also like, telling you what is the solution here and what's the barrier? Is it political will? Is it lobbying? Is it science? What is the barrier here, or some combination?
Paula, could solutions-based stories potentially help with audience fatigue, you think?
I think so. What I see, also echoing what Neela was saying, like it gives to the communities and to the readers and listeners the sense of agency, especially when you go to a community and you're covering a climate solution that was thought for many, many months, everyone together, like people, some NGO, the municipality, and other groups all try to bring everyone to the table. I've covered some solutions that were like this in Massachusetts, for example, doing research of what people really need, what they are concerned about. So this really make people feel their say will turn into something that will help their lives. And I was also looking at the Reuters Institute report on digital news, and they found that even people who say they avoid the news because they are fatigued or because they can't see more tragedy or anything like that, they are interested in solution stories. So both people who read the news and are tired and people who totally say they avoid the news, they are interested in solution stories.
We talk about this all the time, and Amar and I, we've talked about this all the time. The ski season shrinking in New Hampshire. It's obviously a big tourism state, recreation a big business. So there are ways to talk to people in the business community that might be at a more conservative end of the spectrum when you're talking about climate change. Abagael, do you see that in Vermont as well?
Yeah, something that I heard, I think, from a former editor was, people might not use the language of climate change, but everybody in Vermont likes to talk about the weather. And that's something I found as a reporter. I was an agriculture reporter before I was a climate reporter. And I met plenty of people who are farmers who would tell me, I have seen change in the way that my family farm and the resources that I kind of tend to, the way that they sort of manifest, the way that my business runs in recent decades. And they might not be using the language of climate change in some cases, although we have many farmers in our state who are huge proponents of climate action and do a lot of advocacy. But I think that there's a lot of power in climate stories, whether it's after a natural disaster or just about trying to sort of understand what it means to find resilience and to adapt to this future that it's our present reality. Especially in small communities, there's so much to be said, I think, for hearing your neighbor's voice on the radio and just feeling seen and kind of remembering that these changes are things that all of us are experiencing. I think, in northern New England, people are so connected to the landscape. We love where we live. I talked to a youth advocate actually this morning who told me when he feels tired, he goes and sits by the river behind his house. And I love that. I think that that's something that we can all identify with. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to sort of start with the place of what is our shared reality and our shared experience of this place that we are invested in together because it's where we live. And I also think too, there's, as was spoken to by everybody earlier, I find that letting the science drive the stories we tell is hugely important as well. There's a lot to be concerned about, but I think that the science also tells us very clearly that there's still time to make different choices, that there is a window through which we can take action to make the future that we inherit better. And so I think that, ideology is one thing, but as reporters, I do think it's important for us to, help people to better understand the science and make sure our reporting is grounded very carefully in what we know and what we don't know.
Let's talk more about building trust with audiences. Neela, what are the ways that you try to bring NPR's climate coverage to different kinds of people? Whether it's on the political spectrum or...
Right. I think that's a really good question, and I think there are multiple ways that we do it. I mean, the first thing is to tell stories about all sorts of different kinds of people, right? And to talk about their experiences, and even if somebody is suffering through something and they don't identify it as climate change. I mean, people are still experiencing things in communities, and you need to be reporting on that. I think the fact that we on the national network work with member station reporters who have such nuanced and compassionate views, like the reporters you see on this stage, also really helps. And I think that there also needs to be a recognition that climate change reporting is not ideological, but there are forces in the society that have taken the science over the last 30 years and somehow made accepting climate science a political position, and it's not, but it's become a touchstone for some people politically but the fact of the matter is, like, a lot of people who deride climate change as a hoax or something like that, they're, I think, a loud minority, because polling that NPR has done with Harvard and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation a couple of years ago found that the vast majority of Americans, this was a big poll, it's like more than 2,000 people, the vast majority of Americans have experienced climate change largely in the form of heat. I mean, look at us today, right? We are in New Hampshire, and it is, 80-something degrees outside. Like, this is not the way it's supposed to be. I'm not saying this moment is being driven by climate change, but it's more that there are certain trends that are occurring. So people are feeling it. And the polling has shown that across the political spectrum, regardless of how people identify, they see that things are changing. Now, do they ascribe it to to consuming fossil fuels? There's that it's human driven. That's, I think, where you have that kind of partisan divide, right? But I also think that when you look at if a lot of the rejection of climate change happens among American conservatives, there's also a division there among the older generation and the younger generation. And we at NPR time and again have spoken to younger conservatives who see this and they want to do something about it, and they want their voices as conservatives to be part of the solution. And and they're having a hard time breaking through, and they tell us this, right? But this is not, something that journalists have made it ideological. It is the water we have to swim in and function in. And I think that as long as we continue to elevate people's experience, and we also show that people who are calling it a hoax or whatever, are really not just like the regular people out there who are experiencing it, and that there is a diversity of voices among, if you think American conservatives, they don't think climate change is real. That's not true, right? And if we show that and show the solutions they have, and so wait for the stories that we are going to do in this space in the coming months, that's how you get through.
Thanks for listening to the 2024 By Degrees Climate Summit, a collaboration between New Hampshire Public Radio and New Hampshire PBS. Coming up, how heating buildings with steam can impact climate change. Don't go away, we'll be back in 1 minute. Welcome back to the 2024 By Degrees Climate Summit, a collaboration between NHPR and New Hampshire PBS. This panel is titled Rising Tide of Solutions-Based Climate Reporting and was recorded before a live audience on May 23, 2024 at the University of New Hampshire Durham campus. Our panelists are Mara Hoplamazian, NHPR's Climate and Energy Reporter, Neela Banerjee, NPR's Chief Climate Desk Editor, Paula Mora, a New England-based independent audio reporter and former WBUR Climate Desk reporter, and Abagael Giles, Climate and Environment Reporter for Vermont Public. Our panel host is NHPR's Rick Ganley.
A number of stations around the region, NHPR included, work together through the New England News Collaborative. Maura, how's that been working out for us?
Well, I love collaborating. I mean, I know all of these people through collaborations.
And we love having them. I mean, it's great. I'm so glad to be here because of the people who are on the stage. They're great.
Yeah, I've had I think it's really transformed how I think about my job as a reporter, because I get to see really amazing reporters do stories and then feel ambitious myself about the kind of reporting I want to do. Particularly in New England, I mean, we experience really similar climate impacts across the region, but our states handle it in really different ways, policy-wise. And in New Hampshire in particular, it's really helpful for me to have points of comparison, how are other state legislatures handling these problems, and how is New Hampshire's approach different? And then that allows us sort of the long view as we look into the future. How are those policies working out? How are people in these states that are handling climate change really differently experiencing those policy differences?
If you're just tuning into our live stream, welcome. This is the second annual By Degrees Climate Summit. I'm Rick Ganley, your host, and here with us today are some esteemed reporters in the climate space: Neela Banerjee, Senior Climate Desk Editor for NPR; Mara Hoplamazian, Climate Reporter for New Hampshire Public Radio; Paula Mora, an independent audio reporter here in New England; and Abagael Giles, who covers the climate beat for Vermont Public. And just a reminder again, if you've got questions, there's that QR code on the back of your program. Please scan it, give us a question. We'd love to hear from you. Let's turn now to some examples of the kinds of solutions-based stories that we've been talking about today. Abagael, let me start with you because this is kind of breaking news. Vermont Governor Phil Scott has just vetoed a bill that would require the state to source all of its energy from renewable sources by 2035. This was passed by Vermont lawmakers. What has been the arguments for it?
Yeah, this is a really interesting policy. One of the, I think interestingly, the sort of controversy around this policy is not about whether or not Vermont should go to 100% renewable power. Actually, every utility in the state supports this bill, and along with renewable developers, I think as you would expect, and most environmental groups in the state. But where the sort of kind of sticking point, I think, between the governor and lawmakers has been is over how to get there. Essentially, this policy would quadruple the amount of new renewable power that Vermont utilities purchase from the New England region. And essentially why that sort of matters from an emissions perspective is that we have an interconnected grid. So Vermont is absolutely dependent on natural gas burned elsewhere in the region. We are heavily dependent on nuclear power. And by and large, that isn't generated within our borders. We, of course, draw a lot of power from Hydro-Quebec as well. So essentially, in order to sort of offset the fossil fuel dependence in our electric sector as a region, investing in new renewables is really the sort of way to do that. Lots of also important factors there around where they're sited, whether it's where there's demand and storage. Like many New England states, especially rural New England states, we have a very aged and in some places constrained electric grid in Vermont that's going to require very expensive upgrades no matter what we do policy-wise in the coming decades. So essentially, the governor pitched an idea that would have had fewer of those new renewables and would have allowed nuclear power to count as well, with the sort of hope that would have less of a cost burden on electric rates. The best modeling that we have at the moment from legislative analysts in Vermont is that this change would essentially cost between about $5 and $13 on the average electric bill by 2035. There's a lot of uncertainty there around transmission and all sorts of infrastructure, but the long and short of it is, I think there's agreement, interestingly, in Vermont that we need to get to this goal. There's just disagreement about how to do it in the most cost-effective way.
So the governor's vetoed this, but is there a chance for an override?
We actually just before we got on stage heard from our Senate President pro tempore, and he was very clear that lawmakers do plan to attempt an override. The policy, they pretty much had just about close to what they would need, that sort of 2/3 majority in both chambers when the bill moved through the State House this session. That vote would happen in mid-June, so we'll have to see. And this is one of a sort of suite of climate policies, a major flood resilience bill, the Climate Superfund Act, which has gained a lot of attention, I think, in the national media, that the governor is expected right now to probably veto. So this is an election year. I was actually just at a demonstration this morning held by youth activists, high school students on the State House steps, that they were really sort of imploring, lawmakers and the governor to take action on climate. And so I think, again, you kind of see some interesting breakdowns around age and just the way that people sort of think about this question of how fast we need to move and how to do it in the most cost-effective way. I think for a lot of young people I talk to in Vermont, they say, there's really nothing I wouldn't pay to be able to see my grandkids ski, which is a different perspective than is held by others in the state. So I'll leave it there, but.
Okay, stay tuned. We'll be reporting on it, I'm sure. Paula, I want to bring you in here. You reported on some folks in Boston recently using something that is an older idea, steam to heat buildings. How can that help with climate change in the city?
Yeah, so this idea that they have could have a pretty significant impact because do you know that those steam that come from the streets of New York or even Boston and Cambridge, like they are part of a network of miles of pipes that this steam was initially a byproduct of coal, and now it's a byproduct of producing electricity by burning natural gas. So it helps heat a lot of buildings. And the idea that this company has is to use this network of pipes in Boston and Cambridge by changing, again, the source of the steam production to a cleaner source, which would be an electric boiler. So they are finishing the installation of this boiler, and because buildings are responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions in Boston, cutting those emissions from heating the buildings could help the city reach the net zero emissions target in 2050. There's a report that said it could cut roughly 20% of the emissions if the steam to heat these buildings went clean. So the company has about 200 clients in Cambridge and Boston, and these are large buildings. Those clients, they're hospitals, biotech labs, they are museums. So it's very interesting, but also there are some challenges, of course, like no solution is a silver bullet, as we've seen in our reporting. The cost of electricity compared to natural gas is like 3 to 5 times. And also the Massachusetts grid is still mostly powered by fossil fuels. So the electricity that is powering the electric boiler, that would be powering the electric boiler because it's not working yet, would still be generating emissions. And then to become net zero, the company will have to buy renewable energy credits locally, which would add to the cost as well. So in this story, what the experts told me is that lowering building emissions, they're so important to reduce overall emissions. You might be, it is likely to be a combination of many actions, like it could be this cleaner steam, also reducing the energy consumption by increasing insulation, and also changing, installing electric heat pumps. Like there are many solutions for the buildings, and one is this clean steam.
It's an interesting concept because of the economy of scale there you could do with a cityscape, obviously, a building so close together. Mara, you've done a lot of reporting on the move towards community power here in New Hampshire in particular. How is it changing the state's energy landscape?
So community power, just as a I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but community power is this idea that municipalities can become the entity that's purchasing and selling power to their residents instead of a traditional utility company. The utility company still delivers that power through their transmission and delivery system. I think with community power in New Hampshire, it's pretty new. I don't know. For me, it seems sort of too early to say how exactly it's changing our electric or energy system, but something that I've experienced talking to folks in towns, I think more than now 60 towns who either have adopted community power programs or are in the process of adopting them, is just that so many more people are interested in how we get our energy and how their homes are powered, and are taking the steps to go to town meeting, to learn about it, to look at their electric bill, and to sort of care about like how we get our power, which I think, especially with energy, I started as a climate reporter with no energy background. I took Dartmouth's Energy 101 YouTube class to understand how to report on it. And it can be really scary. It can be really opaque. And I think the fact that community power has gotten so many people involved in understanding how the electric system works is really interesting and something that is transformational. Community power providers also say, this system can help us adopt more renewables in the state. I think that's something I'm really interested in learning more about, watching it sort of play out as it goes along. So, yeah.
I do want to talk a little bit more about our region here. New England particularly affected by flooding, as we've seen in the past year and a half. We're seeing the heaviest increase in flood events than anywhere else in the country. Many communities hit hard last summer, especially in Vermont. Abagael, you reported extensively on those floods. How did you see communities come together in the aftermath of that?
It was really pretty incredible. I think that this is a story where the people, just everyday people who saw their neighbors get flooded, who saw just destruction wrought in their communities, deserve the credit for what happened next, which was that we saw grassroots organizations be formed overnight by people, in some cases, who had never been organizers before. We saw these sort of small pockets of very real-time solutions work happening with minimal resources, just because people saw an opportunity to do something for somebody else and they did it. And it was really interesting. I interviewed people who lost all of their belongings but spent the whole night trying to pump out their next door neighbor's basement when they saw that everything they had been taken away, and just these incredible stories about sort of what resilience and community can look like in the face of these terrible, terrible disasters that we know from, lots of research through the University of Vermont disproportionately impact, people who live in mobile home communities, people who are lower income in our state, and people in rural communities. And I think when we talk about environmental justice, something that was a huge takeaway for me from reporting on flooding was that, we as people in this world are not passive recipients of the damage and harm caused by climate change. We have power. And I think that when we think about what the future can look like, for me, it was just a really interesting moment to talk to people who had lost everything and said, I feel more sure than ever that this is the place that I want to be in my community because of the experience I had with my neighbors during this event. I just think that there's something really hopeful there. And, I have talked to many people across the political spectrum who have expressed interest in trying to figure out how do we make our state more resilient to climate change? What do we do to prepare for the next event? And so I think that those are stories that, to me as a reporter, need to be told. We need to hear each other, and we need to hear that even in these moments of terrible despair, I think there's great opportunity for hope.
Thanks for listening to the 2024 By Degrees Climate Summit from New Hampshire Public Radio. We'll be right back with more from our panel discussion focused on the rising tide of solutions-based climate reporting. Coming up, a discussion on how towns and cities in New Hampshire are preparing after devastating flooding. Don't go away. Welcome back to the By Degrees Climate Summit. Today's panel discussion is focused on the role solutions-based journalism can play in affecting positive change in our New England communities. Our panelists are Mara Hoplamazian, NHPR's climate and energy reporter, Neela Banerjee, NPR's chief climate desk editor, Paula Mora, a New England-based independent audio reporter and former WBUR climate desk reporter, and Abagael Giles, climate and environment reporter for Vermont Public. Here's our host, NHPR's Rick Ganley.
Well, how are towns and cities, in particular in Vermont, preparing? I mean, we're talking about municipalities with very small annual budgets. How does the state, how does the city, how does the municipality, how does a small town prepare for future events like that?
This is a question that I think almost every community in Vermont is grappling with right now in a bigger way than we have really, I think, since Tropical Storm Irene, which happened about a decade ago, was really catastrophic. In our state, I would imagine New Hampshire is probably this way too. I know that you have, coastal impacts as well. Much of the flooding that we see is this kind of riverine fluvial flooding. So essentially, rivers move, they jump their banks, and they move really fast, and they take a lot of stuff with them. And that's like the big climate impact that we in Vermont are expected to see more of, with climate change from a sort of natural disaster perspective. And there's actually a bill in our legislature right now that was born out of the challenges that small towns were really going to their delegations and saying, we can't solve this problem on our own, which attempts to sort of take this kind of watershed scale, like the whole river, planning approach to new development in these super hyper flood prone places, which by and large are not regulated right now by the state or by FEMA, by the federal government, which is very focused on sort of inundation flooding. So this is a policy that is pretty kind of revolutionary, and there's been really interesting tripartisan support. This is a major climate bill that would restrict development in a state that, for which that is a super contentious, often partisan issue. And essentially, small towns are saying, we need help. We need the state to help us plan up and down a river to make sure that a town at the top of the watershed isn't doing something that's going to create worse flooding downstream. And the last anecdote I'll add is that we know from an economic perspective, because of our experiences with Tropical Storm Irene, that these policies can make a big difference. There was great modeling done by the University of Vermont that looked at how a major wetland complex just above the town of Middlebury saved that community millions of dollars during that disaster, that in damages that were incurred by another community that didn't have that same buffer on the same river. So I think there's a kind of excitement around, how can we potentially solve this problem?
Paula, I see you nodding your head with Abagael here. What about you? What kinds of solutions have you seen in your reporting that communities on a local level are doing when it comes to the effects of that heavy rain and flooding that we've seen?
Yeah, I was hearing Abagael talking about this wetland that protected one of the towns and much more than the other. And one of the stories I did was in the town of Reading. It's north of Boston. It's part of the Mystic River watershed. And there's this very interesting initiative, the Resilient Mystic Collaborative. It's a group of 20 municipalities and the Mystic River Association that they got together not only to figure out where in the watershed they could make projects that would help reduce flood damage in the future because of the increase of heavy rainfall. So they got together and they ran this computer model and found some places that would be priority. And the first one to get the funding, they got a lot of funding, like they got municipal funding, federal funding, state funding, and we're able to start the project last year. And it's due to be ready in July. What they did is that they found in a tributary of the Mystic River that is in Reading, the Abagael River, they had a conservation area that belonged to the city, to the town, and they dug 7 ponds so that wetland area would be able to hold more storm water when the flash flood or the storm would come. And some of these ponds also filter the water, which is very interesting because the water come from pavement, from homes, and all this type of carrying all types of dirt or other stuff. So it's going to also have the system to filter the water. And what else? What is very interesting that they're doing also, they're enhancing the area not only to hold water, but also to become a more pleasant park and the boardwalks. And what I've heard from other projects, because like the Charles River Watershed Association also has some projects going on, like the idea for downstream communities is that the water goes fast, runs fast, and doesn't have the time to flood. Like they go fast to the ocean.
Well, Mara, you've done an awful lot of reporting on flooding here in New Hampshire. How are towns and cities in the North Country, working to become more resilient?
Yeah, so this story was sort of an effort to follow up in the aftermath of that flood. I think on an individual level, what I heard from a lot of the folks I talked to, so I talked to these three people, one woman who lost her home, the reverend of a church that lost their first floor, and the head of a school that lost 2 of their classrooms. And each of them told me, they never thought that they would see that kind of flooding. Like this woman didn't live in a flood zone, didn't have flood insurance, didn't think she needed flood insurance. The reverend of this church said, this church has been around since the early 1900s. It had never flooded. Similar with the school, been around since the 70s, never flooded. So I think it's just that sort of acceptance that like the way that our relationship to these rivers is changing and has to change as climate change, the atmosphere is warmer, can hold more water, and more water can sort of fall in the course of a storm. And for people who are realizing that in really intimate ways, it's a really hard thing. And also for each of those people, they said things like, I don't want to live near water anymore, or I'm going to be much more careful when I pick the next place I'm going to live. The reverend of the church, they're only rebuilding the top floor of the church. They're not going to redo the basement because they want to know the chances of floodwaters coming again. So I think that sort of like visceral learning requires us to become resilient in some ways, or build resiliency into our lives. These are all people who are recognizing that climate change poses a threat that's larger than they thought it was, and that's requiring them to become resilient. And then on the government level, towns I talked to, particularly the town of Conway, has a sort of Band-Aid approach for this. There's part of town that gets cut off on both sides by flooding, so it becomes sort of like an island. And for the past many storms, they've just stationed an ambulance and a fire truck in that part of town before it starts raining, so that people in that place that becomes sort of an island, this neighborhood, have access to medical care if they're can't get out of their neighborhood for a couple days. And that town, there's this Band-Aid solution, but now they're sort of trying to get federal help to raise the roads that flood out and create culverts and drainage. It poses a money question because it's, even if they get 90% of the project funded, it's still, a tax hike for folks in town, and requires voter input and buy-in. So, I think places are trying to become more resilient and also struggling with the money side of things.
Neela, do you see that? I see you nodding your head too. Do you see that when you're in national reporting for NPR, that towns and cities are trying certain things, but of course it comes down to money?
Sorry. Yes, it does come down to money. Towns and cities are trying things, and one of the interesting things, as you're talking about this, Mara, when I think about solutions, is that you can try solutions and they might not work the first time, right? And that doesn't mean that you just give up. So, for example, Paula, what you were talking about with this effort to slow the flooding along these watersheds. So, last year, what I was pitching was this whole thing about Climate Solutions Week that NPR had. We did a story out of China about this notion of sponge cities. No clue what they were talking about, but basically, it's what we call, green infrastructure. It's like building things like ponds. It's like building things like, culverts. Just basically ways to remove pavement and absorb more water. And there was terrible flooding in China last year and the year before. Lots of people were killed. And John Ruwich, our reporter there, found the guy, the architect who was behind, this landscape architect who was behind this idea. And he was really obviously he mourned the harm, but he also said, it's not like we can't just try solutions. And if something doesn't work perfectly, then we just toss it out, right? And it does require constant investment. We are seeing through the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, more money being made available to states and other jurisdictions to build more resilient infrastructure. And then there are places that are rejecting it. Like one of the stories we were working on last week, which we're still trying to get a handle on, is what just happened in Florida, right? So Governor DeSantis signed a bill that basically says, not only, this is what we're trying to figure out. You can't mention climate change, right? But does it mean you can't consider climate change when you're planning infrastructure? This was also something that you guys might remember played out in North Carolina years ago, right? About a decade ago. So there's, there is money becoming available. It might not be enough, but you also have to have leaders in your communities who are willing to look at what the science is saying about what could happen in their community, what's already happening, because the past is no longer precedent, right? And so and then I think it's incumbent upon your representatives, your governors, your AGs to push either on the local level or on the federal level to get the money to, to build this resilience. So that's at the end of the day, I mean, this country has the money to do it, right? The question is whether we're going to do it.
We're running low on time, and I think we've got to wrap things up. But before we go, I do want to ask each reporter here on stage about what they're working on, what's upcoming for you. Let's start with you, Abagael.
We are looking ahead to our elections in November, and also to the veto session that our legislature is going to be holding in June. Actually, all of the major climate bills this year are expected to be on the docket for potential veto override votes. So that'll be sort of the big focus for me. But I actually love summer in Vermont when the legislature is not in session, because I get to go out into communities and I get to be outside and I get to do stories that are a little bit more in-depth and less reactive to policy. So I'm eager to catch up with folks that I spoke with after the flooding last year, and do some stories there, and just broadly to sort of get out on the ground out of the State House.
Excellent. How about you, Paula?
I would love to follow up with people that I spoke to on these communities as well, to see how they are developing their other plans to be more resilient, not only in the Mystic River, but other places like the Belle Isle Marsh, and also some indigenous communities that have been working to bring traditional indigenous knowledge to more people and to apply them in some areas. Like there's this municipal vulnerability program in Massachusetts that one of the indigenous communities was planning by the time I was reporting to buy back their ancestral land. And it's been 200 years that they went to Wisconsin, I think. And then like, how are they doing now? It would be very interesting to learn about.
Maura?
Yeah. I have a couple of like really wonky energy and policy stories coming up, which I'm really excited about. Interconnection, building codes. And also over the summer working on some animal reporting. So if anyone has animal tips, let me know. But also, following off the offshore wind industry as it gains steam and seeing how that plays out this summer as the federal government holds stakeholder meetings in New England. But yeah.
That is also wonky. So
Not as wonky.
We're like climate reporters, they're just all nerds, myself included. So
There's no nerds in this room.
no
Are you
nerds,
kidding?
zero nerdery in here. Let's see. So last year, Climate Solutions Week, which we did in October, was really successful. And so we are doing it again this year in early September, right after Labor Day. I cannot tell you the theme, but there's a theme that is close to your hearts and your stomachs. Let's just put it that way. So anyway, we're really excited, and we're having more stories from member stations. It's going to be on all of our platforms, digital, audio, and podcasts. And so that requires a lot of work and kind of wrangling. We are also covering the election. Each man who's running for president, putatively, Biden and Trump, each will have been president for a term, and they do have climate and energy records to look at, and I think it behooves us to look at what they've done and what they plan to do, both in a kind of general way, but also to drill down. And then there's other stuff that's coming up that I think will have like a lot of like important news you can use, like about rooftop solar, and there's also a project about how extreme weather. About fatalities from extreme weather and what we can learn, and so that we can reduce the risk of that going forward. But we're really excited. But it's there's a lot of ground to cover between now and the end of the year.
There's never enough time or reporters.
Never.
Thank you for listening to Hour 2 of the By Degrees Climate Summit discussion, The Rising Tide of Solutions-Based Climate Reporting. Special thanks to our esteemed panelists, Mara Hoplamazian, NHPR's Climate and Energy Reporter, Neela Banerjee, NPR's Chief Climate Desk Editor, Paula Mora, a New England-based independent audio reporter and former WBUR Climate Desk reporter, and Abagael Giles, Climate and Environment Reporter for Vermont Public. This conversation was recorded at the University of New Hampshire, Durham on May 23, 2024. The By Degrees Climate Summit is a collaboration between New Hampshire PBS and New Hampshire Public Radio. NHPR's By Degrees reporting project was created in order to tell stories of local people grappling with the challenges of our changing world and exploring possible solutions. If you missed any part of today's program, or if you'd like to support these kinds of community climate conversations, please go to nhpr.org/bydegrees. And whether you're listening in from Maine, the Cape and Islands, Vermont, or streaming this conversation from across the country, please know that your local public radio climate reporters are also worthy of your financial contributions. So support them as generously as you can. And thank you. NHPR's program director is Emily Quirk. Our news director is Dan Barrick. Our events coordinator is Zoe Kay. This panel discussion was produced by Mary McIntyre and Corey Princell. New Hampshire PBS's production manager is Ben Sparling. NHPR's production manager is me, Dan Cahill. Sound engineer for the By Degrees Climate Summit is Andy Dolph. And today's host was Rick Ganley, host of Morning Edition on NHPR. Special thanks to our friends at New Hampshire PBS who made the live stream on these panels possible. And thanks again for listening to the 2024 By Degrees Climate Summit from New Hampshire Public Radio.